So our first panel, I'm going to have Sarah come up and do the introductions for. I'm going to talk about what the framing is. So for the next 30 minutes, our two teams up here are going to talk about their respective projects. And then we're going to have kind of a group question and answer discussion. And then I'm going to ask each of the tables to dive down and really think about what tools, resources, and needs are necessary to really support patient and researcher partnerships. I'll put that question up when we go down to table discussions, but from that, we'll have a report out about what each table came up with. As Makeda is drawing up there, he's going to be putting up what those ideas, thoughts are that are coming from each of the tables. And at the end of the day, that's going to be our framework for really setting forth what are the priorities that we need to move forward in the next coming months as part of our project as it closes out. But what are the other things that might come up as new ideas for folks in this room or groups of us to really focus in on if there's a common interest. So that's the framework for today. We have a lunch that does not involve working over it. It's meant to really allow people time to connect. The last thing I'm going to do is I know some people have to leave early for planes, for trains, for automobiles. If you have thoughts that you don't feel get captured, there's sticky notes at your table. Feel free to write down those thoughts and hand them to Makeda if you want to make sure that they get documented, or feel free to hand them to me so I can figure out how best to integrate them into what we're able to wrap up. So even though you may not be here physically, you can be here in sticky note. So with that, Sarah, I'm going to invite you up to introduce the next panel. Rules of engagement still exist. No questions as of now because my video man is back on until you get the conch shell.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for coming back today. I think it's we're very excited that people are showing up again and that it's a worthwhile use of your time. So as Danielle said yesterday in her introduction to the workshop and the Inspire project as a whole, one of the things that we heard in our initial interviews with patients and researchers was really needing some help identifying what the best models are for engagement in their particular project and how we create deep and meaningful engagement given our project parameters, budget, time, disease area or other area of focus, and how we really craft thoughtful and meaningful engagement out of that. And so as we developed our agenda for this workshop, we really we identified two projects that are doing engagement in some pretty cool ways and wanted to invite them to share how they've set up engagement in their projects, what's worked and what has been challenges, and then really have a good discussion, both as a group and in our tables, about how we can better support and what is still needed to better support structuring engagement for whatever project that you're working on. So today we have a group from Group Health Research Institute here in Seattle with Karen Wernli as the project principal investigator, Dianne Johnson and Mary Bush as patient partners, and Susan Brandzel as that project manager. And you got an introduction to this project yesterday, SIMBA, which is looking at surveillance and imaging for women after breast cancer. And they will be speaking today about how they've structured that engagement in their project. In addition, we've invited all the way from Alaska, Renee Robinson and Adrienne Tveit from the Southcentral Foundation, who are working with a tribal owned and led organization and how they've structured that. So thank you.
Before, you can help us with slides. Oh, super. Thank you.
You don't have to age anywhere. You should be good.
That's amazing. Look at that. Bluetooth really works. Well, thank you all for coming today. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be able to talk about our project on breast cancer surveillance imaging and share it as a model of engagement. We have structured this so that the four of us are presenting. And so we'll go through each section of these presentations, and everybody has a little bit of ownership, but we've also said that we might all speak up at certain points during the presentation. And the way that we've structured it is actually talk about some of the challenges that we've had to overcome or things that you should consider within your own project. I think that sometimes our model has been shown to be more successful, I think, maybe than some other projects, and that doesn't mean that we aren't, still a complicated family and have things that we have to overcome in order to make our communication strong and to work together. So you have learned actually a lot about the project yesterday, but just to give an overview, when we had put in our PCORI application, our overall goal was to fill this clinical gap in knowledge about how well breast MRI works in adjunct to mammography in women who have a personal history of breast cancer or been treated for breast cancer, and really to provide the evidence that's needed to assist patients and providers in making that decision, and then to disseminate the results. And we did this through mixed methods. So we did focus groups and some qualitative research and interviews with doctors, as well as using data that come from a large consortium that had an already existing research team and a lot of investigators together in order to accomplish these goals. For another presentation I gave recently, I came up with this sort of model engagement, and I've put Mary and Dianne in the center as our patient partners, and they influence all aspects of our research. I spoke a little bit about it, you saw in the video, but as part of this research project, we have the research team. So this includes people that you would normally see on a NIH research application, people who have expertise in biostatistics and clinical care, who are there to sort of execute the research methodology. And Mary and Dianne sit within that research team. We also have a stakeholder panel. These include physicians, clinicians of different specialties and backgrounds who practice here in the Pacific Northwest, both in the academic and in the community setting, as well as representatives from partner organizations, Susan G. Komen, the American Cancer Society. And then Mary and Dianne sit within this conversation as well. Our stakeholder panel meets twice yearly for a full day meeting, and it's really been sort of a report in terms of what our research progress has been, and sort of how are we doing and what do we need to be thinking about as we move forward. And then finally, we have a patient advisory board, and these include women that we met, some of whom initially through the focus groups that we did to get the project started, and I invited them to come and be a part of the project ongoing. But as soon as the project was funded, we did a lot of work in order to reach out to communities of color in order to include women who were more diverse than the women who had attended our initial focus groups. And so we have about 12 women, I think, on the patient advisory board. And we meet with the patient advisory board also twice a year for a little bit of a shorter time. It's about 3 hours. And it's lengthened over time as you see that women want to spend time together, have time together to get to know each other and to support each other. And I think that that's been particularly helpful for Mary and Dianne in order to have other women's experiences. So when you're talking about how do you bring both your own and group, being able to have that as a resource for them as they're thinking about conversations they've been a part of or future discussions they might be having, that's really been, I think, a sounding board for them. And putting this slide together, I was thinking, well, where am I exactly? And maybe you're wondering that as well. And I kind of, if you know me, this is perhaps not a surprise, but I think I sort of hug the whole system in terms of sort of spinning it and facilitating it and making it be successful. And that includes both myself and Susan and our team as we try and whoever's doing the day-to-day work in order to get your research project going, compared to some of your research collaborators who are on the telephone with you a few times a month, but not necessarily involved day to day.
So one thing I wanted to bring up on this, sometimes you hear it's hard to keep patients engaged over a long period of time in a study. And when I was looking at this model, I thought, well, yes, we've lost some people off of our patient advisory board and replaced them because of changes in life, moving away or a different job or different things like that. But we've had equally as many people in the stakeholder panel leave and be replaced, and in the scientific team. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is in our society. People move, people take different jobs, people have different time commitments. So I don't think it's fair to always just say it's hard to keep the patients engaged. And the more you're valued and the more that you have a sense of partnership, Mary and I were determined to stick with it no matter what. You know, even if I'm looking for other jobs, it's like, well, I have this other thing and it comes first. So I think that's important to note.
I actually thought when Dianne brought that up yesterday as we were preparing for this discussion, how really valid this point is, because I have heard this a lot, that it's really hard to keep patients engaged. And if I actually thought about what the retention rate was across all of these 3 entities, it probably is pretty similar in terms of sustainability of who you had planned to be on the project versus who's on the project today. So I think that we have 3 sort of problems and 3 sets of solutions, and these are not sort of unique for our project or fully developed in terms of answers for every project. But one of the issues that we've had to overcome is really the pace of research. And this is true when you're talking about just getting the grant. We engaged very early on, and I had said, okay, so we just did all this work and now we have to sit back and wait. So this whole process of, I hope that we get to work together in the future, but I don't know how long this is going to take. And then going through the reapplication process when your proposal isn't funded on the first cycle, and then having to do that all over again and make this new set of promises for another future date. And then, I don't know if PCORI is still doing this, but our funding award was announced at the beginning of September, and we were funded to start on October 1st. So having, now that you've done this really long waiting period to get the application actually funded, then you need to start right away. And not just getting your own research team members on board to start like that, but trying to share with people who don't participate in this process that this is normal, that this is how things usually work, that sometimes they tell you today that it will be funded, but actually you might not know for 6 months that you have been funded, or that when you have been funded and you don't hear till 6 months later that then it actually started 3 months before then. So there's a lot within the funding cycle that could be mysterious and nebulous and hard to overcome. As part of our work, we have traveled to conferences. We've done team meetings in Boston. We've done focus groups across the country. So having them participate in these activities across the country and being able to meet those goals can sometimes be a challenge in terms of availability and making sure that everybody has the time in their schedule to do that and is able to make that commitment.
And Karen, I'll just jump in on that one and say that as many of you know, well, all of us know in our personal lives, when you travel with people, you get to know them in a way that is different than if you're meeting with them even at work every day. And the pace at which people go, we've got to leave at this time to get to this focus group, or we need to be at the airport at this time because of this and this and this. And so it really gets very, very personal, especially with related to issues time management.
Very much so. And then sort of the whole academic process in terms of how research goes. I think we have this example of manuscript preparation, but this is really in terms of acquiring the data, analyzing the data, the conversations that happen around the data, how you go back and reanalyze the data, how the data might be wrong because something didn't happen quite right. So this whole sort of like start and stop, or iterative process that happens over time. We highlight a manuscript that Mary and Dianne led about their experience being involved in a PCORI project. And gosh, it went through several cycles of review, and it had 4 or 5 reviewers. And when we got the reviewer comments back, our response was pages long. And again, I had to assure them, it's a little bit more than we usually get, but we can address these comments instead of sort of throwing your hands up and walking away. So there's a lot of development in terms of bringing your whole team together to understand sort of how research works, the crazy world in which it works, how it doesn't actually all make sense, and how it all comes together. So this is where we segue into other participants. I think it goes to you. I'm passing you. Do you want me to keep doing it?
So Karen posed some of the situations that we've dealt with in terms of making sure that we're all in lockstep with each other, or making sure we're accommodating each other's different needs for timing. But one of the things that I can't emphasize enough, and that I'm sure all of you know already, is the importance of clear communication. And so I know yesterday when we were talking about job descriptions, and some of you were really articulate in saying, I need to know exactly what's expected of me. We have, as people who execute research, we really have to press ourselves to say, if I were in their shoes, would I know what that other person's talking about? Would I know what I'm expected to do and when? And so Mary and Dianne can tell you they receive lots of emails from me that have a bolded and underlined date and time, whether it has to do with, when we'd like to see their comments on something, or when we're going to be meeting. And they don't see that as me yelling at them. They see that as me helping them to know exactly, what they need to do and by when. Frequent communications. So Karen and I are at work, as many of you who are in academics know, steeped in not only this project, but oftentimes many other projects too. And we're all on that, trying to get the grant, to do the grant, to finish the grant, to get the grant kind of habit trail. And Mary and Dianne are in their daily lives, and SIMBA is a part of their daily lives, but it's less part of their daily lives. And so they might be thinking, I wonder what's going on. I wonder when we're going to hear from them next. I wonder what we're going to be expected to do next. And so we have to remember to touch base regularly with the players on the team who aren't necessarily on the 5 days a week cycle, 6 days a week cycle that we're on, to make sure they know what's going on. They feel included, they feel informed, they feel like they can play the role they've been asked to play. Honest about actual versus perceived time. I think that we put this here. First of all, many of us have talked about how difficult it is to figure out at the beginning of a project. Well, it's difficult to figure out what you're doing, regardless of your role. You design this magnificent plan, and then you get it funded, and you go, ooh, how are we actually going to do this? And we had to come up with, for instance, how we were going to pay the two of you, at what rate we were going to pay. And we were the first PCORI cycle, so there was no model whatsoever to build from. And then you have to estimate, well, how much time do you think we're going to need from them? And we made some lists of activities we thought that they would be involved in and tried to quantify it. But the reality is they were so effective, they were so engaged, they were so committed that we just kept wanting to ask more and more of them because they were making such a great contribution. But at some point in time, I turned to Karen and I said, Karen, I think we're asking more of them than they expected, and more of them that we're paying them. So we actually made a decision to increase the amount that we were paying them in the middle of the project. And obviously ask them, are you willing to sort of formalize this increase in FTE, if that's what you want to call it? And so I'm glad that we were able to do that. And quite frankly, we probably should have doubled it yet again, if not more. At some point in time, you hit a budget limitation. And so then we have to communicate with them, hey, you guys, if we're asking too much, first take it as a compliment. It means that you're really giving a lot to this project, but draw the line. If it's not something you can do, it's not something you can turn around, that's something that Karen and I have to learn and be willing to accept as well. So I think, again, that circles back to the open communication issue of tell us what your needs are so that we're all comfortable and on the same page. Who's on 7? This is me again.
This is the problem. This is not the solution.
This is the problem.
Yeah.
If I had to describe my role on this project, one of the things I would say is as a translator. So, I'm a master's level scientist. I have scientific training. I'm a project manager, so I'm a logistician and administrative. And I also, like Karen, this might be why we work well together. I have a nurturing gene. And so I felt protective of Mary and Dianne, especially as they enter the piranha-filled river of academia. And I remember going to Boston together, having our first annual meeting, and there was a concurrent PCORI application due, and there were some scientists attending who were having these side conversations and these side meetings, and you all have probably been in some of these meetings where people are looking down at their computers, and all of a sudden they sit up and they blurt something, and then they put their heads back down again. And that thing they blurt might also not necessarily be the most sensitive or well thought out thing. I remember in another meeting, actually an early meeting, and I might be stealing your thunder, but having an oncologist say, oh, biopsies aren't really that big of a thing for a woman once she's had breast cancer. Now, what she intended to say is, boy, these women have been through a lot, and so maybe a biopsy isn't as painful or as long of a process or as taxing as a chemo session or whatever. But what it came across as is totally trivializing a really emotional, difficult experience. Is that fair to articulate?
Yes.
And I picked up on that, and I looked over at them, and if I could have like thrown my body across them and said, leave them alone, you know, that's what I felt like doing. But it took Karen and me and Mary and Dianne advocating for themselves to really train the group of people who weren't accustomed to being in the room with patients, with more real people, to say we've got to pay attention to the vocabulary that we're using.
I think somebody said this yesterday, that their patients are afraid of the clinicians are afraid of the patients. I think when you bring patients into, in my case, an already established research team, all of a sudden you've shifted the dynamic a little bit, and they're sort of not exactly sure how to behave differently. And so instead continue to behave the same way. And you're like, well, actually, we need to change it a little bit so that we can include others in this conversation. I think as those of us steeped in academic research, we sometimes forget the words that we say, how that we are saying them. I was exactly this example that Susan has just brought up, and what that means to other people. It's really the sort of the dirty laundry about how we talk about research behind the scenes, and trying to integrate new people into this conversation can be really challenging.
Yeah, and I will just say that that was our first stakeholder panel meeting, which scared the willies out of me, you know, because there were these oncologists and some from the cancer center I had been a part of, not my direct link, but I knew them. I knew who they were and what level they were. And so I sat there and I was like, I can't let that pass. I can't let that pass. And finally I spoke up and I just said, you know, from all the women that I know, you may put on a brave face. You're going to go through it because you want to know the answer, but it's a big deal. It's a big deal at 2 in the morning because you know that if it comes back and you have cancer again, what you're facing. And what I was so thankful for was then our Komen representative at that time was also a cancer survivor, and she said, she's exactly right. So it was really nice to have another voice in there to confirm that I wasn't just reacting from my own personal space, but that was more of a collective view of people. And that gave us a point then that we could enter into the conversation because it did change some of the way people talked.
And on a different note with regard to vocabulary, actually, I think it was Dianne and Mary's idea to create a dictionary, which we did early on in the study, of terminology that we thought we might be using. Some of it was related to breast cancer or oncology, some of it related to research. And for a period of time, we expanded it. I'd say we had 2 or 3 versions of it, but honestly, we could have kept going the whole time because, as you all know, there's just so much jargon in the culture of research.
Can you switch the slide? Because that goes to the solutions. I think it's on there.
Apologies. I stole someone else's.
Yeah, I think we're kind of pushing the time limit here. I have a whole page of things to say, but I just want to say a couple of them that are important. One is that in one of our presentations, Karen did mention that having a great project manager really helps with patient engagement. And I try to reinforce that because if we didn't hear from Karen, we heard from Susan. If Susan wasn't available, Karen was always available. We were always included, and that was neat. Having 2 patient partners is great because if emergencies come up or you've got a vacation planned or whatever, you can kind of punt for each other. We had the benefit of resources at the Group Health Research Institute. I can now tweet because I went to a tweeting workshop. And so from DC, I was tweeting, and some of my tweets were retweeted, which I found out was really great. And we had a workshop, or a one-to-one really, with their press person to figure out how to talk to reporters, which is very good because you don't want to really put your foot in your mouth. And we've learned about plain language. We've just had a lot of valuable input from everybody, including we all on the advisory committee got copies of what is a p-value anyways, because we're trying to figure out why we can't say this and this about the research findings when you just really can't do that if you know your statistics, which of course I totally didn't know. So this was very helpful. I've been stuck on this chapter for about 6 months. And finally, I did want to say just a couple of things. We only had encounters with police twice in this 3 years. And I want to put in a plea for old people on research projects. I think it's the next slide. Do you know how to make that go to the next one? We have an annual hike to do team building. And the first year we did the Natchez Loop, which was okay. I kind of stood, it's at Mount Rainier, and I stood back from the edge as we chatted and we're going along. And then the second year, I did mention that I had a problem with heights. So we went to Rattlesnake Ledge in Issaquah. And I'm like, come on, you guys. So what? Okay, so fortunately, Susan's knee kind of gave out on the way down, and I could stand on one side of her. Well, this year, we're going to Twin Falls. So I Googled Twin Falls and it's got these gorgeous waterfalls. And Dianne just tells me there's a bridge where you can walk across the waterfall at the top.
But you don't have to.
Anyways, it's been great, and it's been one of the highlights of my experience. So, knowing these people.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our project, and those of you who have already done that know that that's a hard place to be. And part of it is how are we going to have closure with our advisory board, with the people we work with. There isn't a plan at this point that's set in concrete about dissemination because we don't have funding yet for that. And so if we do get funding, are we going to be able to still get information from our great patient advisory board? Are we still going to be able to get information from our great panel of stakeholders that have been all along contributing to ideas for dissemination? Do you want to go to the next slide? So this is our advisory board, a picture. And I can't say enough about being with them and having their experiences to take forward and seeing their ideas about how to disseminate the information. And from our focus groups, we were allowed to go and be a part of those focus groups. And again, those were more voices to take to the table. And from the get-go, people were like, I don't want it just to be a computer program that I go and look. I really want a discussion with my doctor. So how can we do that? And for a lot of people, at the end, I need a piece of paper because I'm going to forget what I learned in talking to my doctor. And we had a group called Artifact that came and wanted to help develop a prototype of something that could be used. And so all of our advisory board were offered an opportunity to be a part of that prototyping, going down and talking about interface and how they liked it or didn't like it. It's on a tablet. It could be something in a, possibly in a doctor's office where while you're waiting, you can fill out the information, or before you come to the appointment, you can do it. And then you have something to discuss ready about your imaging going forward. And it just lends itself to having a discussion right then and there around specific things. And the doctor would already know what's important to you, what your values are around that, and why you're leaning one way or the other. And then the doctor could give their expertise on one way or the other, what would be better, mammography only or mammography plus MRI. So, and then we were also talking about, are there other ways to disseminate our information? It was so empowering to our advisory board and to us to be learning things all along the way. How can we give that to other women? And it was anywhere. We've had these reporters randomly calling us once in a while. Can we get into a magazine, a women's magazine? One woman is writing, is it for O Magazine? For O, yeah. Something like that, so that it can be out there broader to people. We have Susan G. Komen and American Cancer Society on our stakeholder panels. Could they distribute something out through their networks to people to know more about these findings that we get when we go out? So it's just things to think about. There's more ways to disseminate than just writing a journal article that only a set number of people will read.
That's the end. We have gone quickly through different challenges, the way that our project has worked, and I think we have a lot of opportunity for discussion after we hear the other group give their presentation. Thank you for your time.
So good morning. So Adrienne and I would like to actually walk you through some of the activities that have happened at Southcentral and give you a little bit of an idea of how stakeholder engagement is really part of our culture at Southcentral, and then to highlight some of the examples of how we've collaborated together on different projects that have resulted in things that actually ended up in clinics. So just kind of overview of where we're going to go, because it'll seem like I have way too many slides, but I swear most of them are pictures, so we're going to kind of go from there. Just a little bit about the institution, about our culture, talking a little bit about some of the models that we've used, so community-based participatory research, and kind of, yeah, I know there's acronyms, I'm really working on that. And then kind of what does it really mean and how does it inform research at SCF? And then a couple of the projects that we have, so showing how it really basically improved and changed research at SCF. And SCF is Southcentral Foundation. So just a little bit quickly about the vision and mission of Southcentral Foundation. So the vision is really a Native community that enjoys physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual wellness. And so when we're thinking about it, everything that we do within Southcentral is focused on really getting this mission and vision met. So to kind of give you a little history, Southcentral actually took over their care from Indian Health Service back in 1998. Which was really pivotal. And so what they did was actually take all of the funds that IHS was giving, or Indian Health Service was giving, and they divided it not into small tribal organizations, but they actually formed corporations across the whole state. So different Native corporations were formed, and then all of the Native corporations gave some of their funds to basically sponsor a hospital, which is across the street from us. So Southcentral actually does the Anchorage service unit. And so you'll see kind of the different areas. So we actually do that small little kind of bowl area down in the bottom that you could see Southcentral with the little arrows. And so we also cover that whole Aleutian chain. So when you're thinking about what's the scope, we actually cover all of those little islands, similar to what you see on Deadliest Catch. We cover Dutch Harbor.
Do you have the laser on?
That's what I was trying to find. I'm so like.
Oh, here we go. This is the red one.
Oh, perfect.
So,
Is it working? Yeah, you just point it more towards its hitting the wall.
oh, is it?
Oh, I see it now.
I don't see it on the screen though.
Oh, maybe.
On the TV. Yeah, I see it at the bottom. Anyway, so from the end of the island up to Anchorage where it says Southcentral Foundation, that's a 3.5-hour flight.
Color. What color are you talking about?
Oh, the pink. I think that's pink.
I'll be big enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, from there to where Southcentral in the middle. Yes, right here. That's about 3.5 hours. And so distance is a big issue for our state.
Yeah, so it's 55 different villages within that small community. A majority of them are only accessible via by plane or by boat. And so there's certain times of the year that it's really hard to actually provide services for our customer owners. So actually one more back about so Southcentral was founded in 1998, and there's this great story which I love to tell, is our CEO was actually working at the front desk in the old Native hospital. And so she worked her way up and basically has changed the entire culture. So when Indian Health Service was, or when the tribal organization took over ownership, they actually held multiple focus groups with the customer owners, which is what we call our patients, because they're customers as well as owners of the healthcare system, and asked, what did you like, what didn't you like, what do you want? And all of those kind of infrastructure questions were actually how we drove the patient-centered medical home model that we actually use today. So customers said that they wanted a provider and a care system where they didn't have to re-explain every single time they came in. They didn't want to have emergency care or have to sit in the waiting room in the emergency room or urgent care all day just to get served. They wanted immediate care. They wanted their providers to know. They didn't want this fluctuation of providers, so it was kind of a revolving door for IHS, where individuals would come and basically do their training and then leave. And so they really wanted to try to focus on growing their own to take over the healthcare system and really provide that central kind of healthcare. And so with that, the core concepts were really to work together in the relationships, to learn and grow from each other, to encourage, to listen with an open mind, and to focus on kind of that engagement with every customer that came in the system. And then we also have to laugh and humor through the day, which I should have included some fun pictures, but I figured I already had 43 slides, so that was too much. And then to kind of engage others with compassion and then share our stories. And so that's kind of where we come a lot with this research, is in 2006, they actually established a research department in order to answer some of the questions that they found were not there in other communities. So what was happening across the country in research didn't really seem to be applicable to the needs that our community actually had. And so historically, we had partnered with academic facilities to answer some of our questions, but the thought was, shouldn't we be driving our priorities? And so it's not actually, I would say, customer owner-driven research is really kind of how we consider it, but what are the questions and what are the healthcare needs that we have? So we basically guided by 3 priorities: the health priorities and interests of the stakeholders. So every year in all of our kind of gathering events in which everybody who is a potential stakeholder in the organization actually comes, and they're asked for their opinion. They also do surveys and different things, and we also have customer owner committees that are basically helping to drive things outside of the other health priorities that we identified. And so kind of when we think of our stakeholders, we think of customer owners, providers, organizational leadership, our executive committee, the board of directors, and anybody else who's really touching our healthcare system. So I just love this picture. It kind of shows like what is the diversity of customer ownership and who are our customer owners. They're from multiple tribal organizations, have different heritage. They are all working together for the health and wellness of our community.
Can I see your slide, 2 slides back, please?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Funding opportunities, thank you.
No problem. So what I'd like to do is now actually give a little bit of an example of some of the projects and how they came about and what it actually involved. So this is an example of a research project, and I swear I'm not going to quiz you on all the words, but to kind of focus on that aim 1. So almost every one of our studies that we have throughout any of our research kind of endeavors always focuses on exploring and identifying what are the true needs and preferences of the customer owners who are going to be affected. And so in this study, we actually went to the Native American Research Centers for Health, another acronym, and we looked at tobacco cessation and tobacco utilization in our community. And so something that many people might not know is there's genetic differences in how people break down tobacco, similar to alcohol and other kind of substances, other medications. So just because you smoke 1 pack per day doesn't necessarily mean that the health effects are equivalent for other people who smoke 1 pack per day. And so what we noticed is that the health effects, both cancer as well as some of the COPD or respiratory effects or the lung effects that people were having were much worse in our community. And we were trying to figure out exactly why. And so they had this other study that we read about that was actually happening up in the YK Delta area, which is in the northwest of Alaska, and they found that there was these differences in these 2 genes that affected how people were breaking down tobacco. So 1 pack per day actually looked like it was like 3 packs per day. So that made a lot of sense to us of why people were having trouble potentially quitting, because they were getting a lot more tobacco in their system and it was staying around longer. So then we had this idea, and we asked, we went to our community and asked tribal leadership and said, what do you think about looking at genetics and seeing if people would be interested in having kind of some sort of testing to figure out if they could guide which treatment would work best. So just because everybody in our system was getting nicotine patches and nicotine gum because it was the cheapest alternative, is that really the best? And were we setting people up for failure? Because now we gave them something they felt that they personally failed when it wasn't them at all. It was the agent was the wrong agent for them. And so what we did in our aim to explore kind of stakeholder preferences is we actually did twofold. So we did semi-structured interviews with customer owners to identify, would this be potentially something the system should look at? And also sharing with them the costs and kind of what the potential giveaways would be. And then we also did what we call it's a Delphi method, which is just a fancy method for saying we basically had a group of providers or clinicians that we asked them a bunch of questions, and then we basically compiled all that information from them and had them rank what they thought, and then we brought it back to them over and over. So we made them revisit, and we reminded them what they actually said. So it was kind of this kind of going back and forth of, okay, so we think this is what you said, we think this is what you want. Is this right? Are we hearing correctly? And kind of went back and forth about how could we potentially do something like this within clinic. And then I'd like to step back for just a second and give Adrienne a little bit of time to talk about her experience as being part of this stakeholder engagement piece.
So part of this, I was asked at the beginning to be a part of it, and I went through some of the focus questions that were determined for the focus groups for the other individuals who are part of the survey. Not only am I a clinician within our healthcare system, I'm a customer owner. So I get both those aspects. And so I felt being a clinician and a customer owner, I had to represent both sides. And I did, and I was able to take my personal experiences with myself and my family, but as well as my work environment and what I saw with our customer owners within the clinic. And let's see. I think that's it.
So just like that. So yeah, so on the semi-structured interviews covered kind of the views of tobacco, the experiences with tobacco of friends and family, and then the views of the pharmacogenetics and what that could potentially be. And so that was just a little bit about that. Oops. Sorry, those slides where you click on it always seem like a good idea until you start using them. So the goal of personalized medicine and kind of what we were trying to get at with the pharmacogenetic study was the right drug, the right dose, the right indication, the right patient or customer, and the right time. So are there ways that we could better tailor it to our system and let people have what would be, or make available what people have? Because 2 other things I realized I didn't state up front is that at our institution, it's approximately 60% of our employees are Alaska Native or American Indian. And also what we have as far as a system is a prepaid healthcare system. So customer owners don't actually see a lot of the charges. It's through some of the Indian Health Service as well as insurance and different kind of grants that we get that the costs are not necessarily transferred to the customer owners. And that's on purpose to make sure that as much of the system is provided for customer owners.
When I want to jump in real quick. And another thing that we've recognized is not only when the customer wants to not tell their story over and over again or their symptoms over and over again for healthcare, since they wanted that consistency, we have integrated healthcare teams. So when customers come in to see their provider, they will only see that provider. But of course, providers need to take time off and go to conferences and things like that. So we'll have team coverage providers. So they'll see maybe just a couple of people at the same time. And then those providers discuss things with each other. And so they're familiar with the customers. So then when the customers call in, they have that history and they know what's going on. So you actually use your time more wisely. And then the customer owners feel appreciative and heard on their end.
And so this is just an example of our team who actually has done the tobacco cessation. So the multiple other aims, we had an actual pharmacogenetic aim, which we had asked participants to share biomedical specimens so we could test and see if there were genetic differences. And then we're currently in the third aim, which we're actually matching people based on their genetics to what tobacco cessation treatments they've chosen, and seeing if that impacts the success of the program. So we're very early in that. We have 15 customer owners, yay, that's huge. And so we're on the way to the 150 that we're looking at, but we just started. And so these are some examples, and we utilize this in a lot of the informational materials that we kind of convey to the community that's participated. So everybody who participates in any study actually gets updates. And we ask them how often they want updates to make sure that we're not overwhelming, because some people don't want the updates. But at least every 6 months they're offered, and we give them an update of where we are in the study, knowing that sometimes we have to say, we are still recruiting, and here's how many customer owners have decided to participate, and we're still kind of going on that. But we share a lot of the de-identified comments with customer owners so that they could learn from each other. And then the information is also shared in the Anchorage Native News as well. So everybody who participates gets their own individual results and information, and then we also share information through the Anchorage Native News. So study 2, so I swear there's only 3 studies. So the PCORI study, what we're looking at with the PCORI study was basically depression management. And I want to tell this story because I think it's really interesting. I was actually in another meeting with our vice president who started complaining about the fact that we spend all this money and we provide drugs for people for depression and nobody takes them. And so I'm a pharmacist, I kind of got interested, my ears I go, do you know if anybody really wanted the medication? Did you ask? And he's like, well, I'd assume so. I'm like, but do you know? And so we ended up actually writing for a PCORI grant to actually help walk through all of the options people had for depression management. And this was really kind of an interesting and novel way to kind of think about it, is that there were so many things that we have available within our healthcare system, from traditional healing to complementary medicine to even the exercise center that we have. All of these things can be used to modify mood and behavior. And so did people actually know about all the things that we had? And as a provider, do you usually only talk about what you're familiar with? So I know I probably talked about medication way more than I should have, but that's what I felt comfortable about. So what we started on is basically identifying what people wanted to hear about with depression. Because depression is not actually a historically kind of discussed cultural kind of norm. People don't use that word to actually discuss mood. So they may say they don't feel as well, but the word depression doesn't mean as much within our community, or it wasn't actually informed by our community. And so we looked at developing then a stakeholder decision support tool, and then kind of looked at how could we evaluate if this actually made a difference in health outcomes for our community. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of timeline, nothing in research moves very fast. And so we started with our grant for the PCORI grant in 2011, and we actually didn't get to start with recruitment for the actual decision support tool to 2013. And we had lots of kind of interesting steps in the way, and that's what I wanted to kind of focus on. And so this is actually our decision support tool, so I'll leave that in the background. But I have to admit, this was my first experience with customer owner engagement. So we established a committee, a steering committee of customer owners, providers, tribal leadership, and brought everybody into a room. And I wanted the checkoff. I wanted to bring my idea of decision support tools. I mean, I had gone through 6 months of training with people in Ottawa. I was ready. I had my 90 slide decision support tool, because apparently I'm always a little excessive. And so I brought that tool into the first meeting, and I'm like, this is what I want to do. It's awesome. I think you're going to bless it. You're going to say it's great. Let's keep on going. And that was not at all what happened. It was like, you are all wrong. And I'm like, no, that's not true. And so this whole process of kind of coming back and trying to figure out exactly what we needed to do and how we needed to do it. And so kind of with decision support tools, and I'm not sure if anyone else in the room is like totally passionate about decision support tools, but there's all of these things that you're supposed to have for it to be called a decision support tool. And they even have checklists. And I'm a scientist, I love checklists. And so this checklist, I said, well, it needs to have this, it needs to have this. And I kept on coming back to the community and saying, well, what about this? Well, no, we don't want that. And so what I realized is that what we were actually developing is more of a discussion facilitation tool, but it has true utility as a discussion facilitation tool. The decision support tool would never have been used. It would have been great. It would have been in a box somewhere. And so what we did was kind of bring that whole community together and kind of try to figure out what was the tool. And I'm just going to actually go through the slides while Adrienne talks a little bit about kind of her being part of that group that crushed my heart and took my leg.
Yes. Oops, sorry. So at the beginning, we had different folks that went through the decision support tool that they created, and they were very excited about it, and it looked nice. It was it had lots of different aspects to it, so you can click on one area and it would bring up a whole bunch of different options that you could pick, but the customers didn't really like the way that went. And so they had to completely change it all. But the nice thing about it is it gave them options. And so a lot of the customers, when you talk about depression, they just think a mental illness. They don't, and then they think they're going to be stigmatized. And so then when you give them these different areas of what it means, then they understand more about it, and then they're more likely to be engaging in different opportunities to help themselves, whether it's behavioral treatment, seeing a behaviorist, or medication, or both. And then we have a lot of opportunities, as Renee said before. We have a wellness center on campus, so with all different kinds of exercise classes. I mean, you could take Zumba if you'd like. And that's open not only to our customer owners, but to our employees as well. And then, let's see. And the nice thing about the decision tool, it was on an iPad, and they could go at their own pace. And if they wanted to, they can go back. And then it gave them options. Let's see. And yeah, so here's just some of the different things that it asks. And the nice part about the bottom, what we wanted to know is how it felt to them. Because that was a big thing with the community, is if we were going to do a lot of work, it had to have some meaning to them, otherwise it wasn't going to work at all.
Well, and one other point kind of that we did try to do here with exploring the decision, and I'm just backing up for a second, is letting people up front before the discussion starts share what was the least and what was the most important to them. And that was really important because if I decided I didn't want medication, I really didn't want you telling me all about it. I wanted to focus on what I was interested in learning about. And so in my period of time that I had with the provider, I wanted to focus on what I was interested in. And it helped people communicate their interests and also have that shared vernacular. So when I have the same words, it's way easier for me to communicate and say, like, I know that I don't want peer support groups. And so maybe I didn't know that that was the word that I needed to use. And so it gave this way to communicate that really made it a little more efficient, but it also felt empowering to the customer owner. And so
yeah, and it was like them making the decisions, especially with the decision support tool where it says learn more. They could learn more about something, and then they could go to their provider and ask more about that.
And then as an adjunct, we also had a web page that was developed that mirrored. So it looked similar to this, which all of this artwork and different things were actually decided upon by the community. So they helped, and most of them were pictures of our community members who volunteered to be part, which was surprising to me because I thought, oh, if I'm going to have an app about depression, who's going to want to have their face, as the sign of depression? But we had many, many volunteers who were very adamant about wanting to participate. But we ended up developing an actual web page in which had more like clinical information that they felt that they could trust about what was really available. So I could talk about, and some of the questions were, I wanted to share it with my family and friends to make the decision. And so if I wanted to bring that home to them, I wanted to be able to show them exactly what I saw. And so what we wanted to do is have a way that they could mirror it.
Or that they could bring them along to their appointment with the provider, and then the provider would know that it would be okay to share that kind of information.
And then there was like a summary screen that was available to the provider. So within seconds, they could scan it and know exactly what they should focus their discussion on.
So I'm actually going to just in time,
yes.
We're about 15 minutes over. I want to make sure there's enough time for group discussion. And we have a flight that leaves this afternoon, so I want to make sure we stay on time for the second session.
Sure.
But it's been a lot of great information. I think a lot of different examples about how engagement has been set up in different ways, different flavors of it, as well as the impact it's had on the research dynamic. So
Can I just add one point?
Yeah, for sure.
So just one last point. So I wanted to make one exciting thing. So then we actually went for an EAI engagement grant to actually disseminate the information from the support tool. And the support tool is actually launched in all of our 6 clinics now. And the leadership is actually paying for the additional fees for keeping it active. So there's some licensing fees in order from Apple to be able to license it. But we actually were able to disseminate that information, utilize it, and actually use the EAIN funds on implementation so that people are familiar with it. And we've used the PEP screens in the clinics to talk about kind of what are some available resources, and people have actually asked and been part of it on a clinical basis, kind of looking at it going forward. So it's something that's actually used, which makes me happy.
I think that's a great example too of how if you have that buy-in and that engagement early on, then it helps sustain the work that you've done. So I want to take the next 15 minutes to have any questions or even reflections from your own work. I know I talked to Carrie yesterday at the end and talked about models for pediatric engagement. That's not something we've talked about, but we certainly have people who represent parent partners or folks that do work in pediatrics. So if you have ideas or things to share about models and how they may differ for your experience, I would welcome those. Any thoughts or comments from the group? Yeah, Michelle.
Alaska folks. In the opening slide, in your opening slide, talked about the vision, and spirituality was part of that. And I don't know about the Alaska culture, but I know in the state of Washington, tobacco has a very strong spiritual aspect for the Native American cultures here in Washington. I don't know about Alaska. I didn't hear any spiritual connection. Heard the clinical, and in your opening slide you said that was part of it. So I'd like to know how you connect up the spiritual aspect of tobacco with the tribes, and then also with depression or anything else. How do you loop in the spiritual side of that with the culture you're dealing with?
Sure. So I'll start with one just comment about tobacco in the Alaska Native community. It's actually not inherent in the Alaska Native community. It has been used after many years of being kind of incorporated from tribal nations in the lower 48 as part of their tribes. So there's a lot of kind of individuals have come from the lower 48 who are part of the American Indian community who do use tobacco in some of their kind of cross kind of ceremonies, but it's not inherent in our community. And so that's one aspect. As far as the spirituality, we actually have learning circles and different things that we didn't get to talk about that focus on engaging both the peer support, but as well as focusing on prayer circles and different things like that that have been utilized and are offered to individuals, as well as we have prayer groups and different things through traditional healing that are offered as other options. And so.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off of that. So not only do we have our primary care clinics, which support Western medicine, but we have our traditional healing clinic with our traditional healers that they can be referred to, and they can have discussions and do other traditional healing type of activities to help with that spiritual portion.
I have a question that when you were talking about the research process, one of the things that we heard in interviews is it would be great to have a research 101 from the researcher perspective that we could share with patients to explain to them about what research is. And from patients, we heard it'd be great to understand what the research process is and what that trajectory looks like. And listening to you talk, Karen, you realize how crazy our world really is in terms of what we go through, what we write very quickly in order to then carry out over 5 years. So I'm curious if other people have had similar experiences, or you've talked about setting realistic timelines. Have you changed anything about the way you do research or the way you think about your timelines or setting those up differently? And Mary and Dianne, if you have recommendations for how to change the process of research so it isn't so crazy, would welcome those as well.
I feel kind of hopeless about that in a way. I'm sorry, but not from this experience. I know PCORI has this big thing about open, like sharing and kind of taking the competition out of research. But we hang out at the Research Institute. I have lots of friends at the University of Washington, and their lifeblood is competition over research. You don't get tenure, you don't get to keep your job unless you keep bringing money in. And so I don't know what the solution is. It's hard. Maybe if more of us patients get involved, and I do think there's a push to get like research to market sooner and all of that, that we're on the right track. But it's really quite overwhelming in many ways. One thing, we found ourselves reading research proposals, which is like, huh? But if you really look at them, we made contributions, and I grew to really trust Karen because this stuff I kind of wrote in the margins appeared in the grant. That was really neat. PCORI also announces on TV, or you can find it on your computer, who gets the grants. And so we knew the day that it was our grant was up for getting rewarded, and I'm watching my computer and I'm like, hey, I think that's it. And it was so exciting. So there's pros and cons to all of this. It was a very big deal.
I think picking up on this overwhelming feeling, sometimes I think when you're talking about Research 101, it's almost on a need-to-know basis, because if you give too much information, it really can become overwhelming. And so it's sort of need to know plus a little bit just to get to the next part where you give a lot more information as you go through the process. We did not do a Research 101, but that's a really good idea.
And I think we had a situation where Mary was a nurse, and so she was more in the know about this stuff. I came from completely another world. And so yeah, I was just like, we would wait and we'd find out this deadline and then that next long wait. And so I just kind of like had to put it completely out of my mind, like, oh, if that ever happens, they'll get a hold of me again. And it is frustrating, the hurry up and wait. And then the fact that they're juggling multiple projects. Ours is waiting for data also, which we have had to wait the 3 years to get enough data there. But you think, well, wouldn't it be more efficient to take a study and just work on it, boom, 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 and be done, put all your effort into that instead of always this split thing. But then you always have to be looking for the next grant. And the whole process is really set up really screwy.
I did want to make a comment about one of I think the valuable things that Dianne and I did. We were really involved with the advisory group, and they're like really good people, and we got really attached to them. But we also were going to the research meetings, and so we would say things to the researchers that represented the patients, and then we would go to the patients in the advisory group and say, you guys wouldn't believe it. These people have dedicated their lives to finding a cure for what we have. And we would present a really positive view, which I don't think patients always see when they're dealing with their clinician. And we did likewise with the stakeholders. We would bring feedback and then bring feedback the other way. And we actually got this, last year we got the stakeholders and the researchers together, and it was an amazing meeting. I mean, so many ideas were flying around, and people were so collegial and congenial. It was fun. So for our final meeting, we're going to bring all of the advisory board members in and have all three groups together. And I think that's one way to help with getting research out there.
And I'd like to add one thing too, and I don't know if everybody knows about it, but institutions are given money on top of what the grant is. So there's a whole indirect amount of money. So when you think about it, for our institution just giving you dollars, if we get $100,000, the institution gets another $34,000 on top, just for lights, everything else, and making sure to run it. I ask, they can only say no. And so it's asking for those things. If we need additional funding or sponsorship for different patient engagement kind of efforts, and when it's integral within our culture, and if I can basically show that to them and how it changed our research projects in the past, we've been able to get some funds to host different events to make sure to utilize that. And group health gets a lot too, because we can't afford to partner sometimes. But so they would get like 54 on top at least. And so asking for some of those funds as investigators when we're bringing in money is kind of, I think, integral to kind of have people know that.
Nancy?
So I have a question. These are all great stories. There are sometimes crazy patients, right, who get involved in a project, and you walk into a room, and this has happened to me more than once, where I go, I've got to get that person out of here because he or she is not helping the tone of the conversation, and they're obviously in a lot of pain in some way, shape, or form. So I'm curious whether you guys have had that experience and how you've handled it, what you've done, because it's so hard when somebody's there because they're passionate about something, but then they aren't contributing. And that's something that scares researchers to death because they don't want to have to fire us. So I'm just wondering how you do that.
You know, we had a situation that was a little more manageable than what you're describing, where someone had a political agenda and they brought materials to a meeting that they wanted to share, and it wasn't completely separate from the cause, but I don't know, Karen has a really, I mean, you've seen it, she has a very diplomatic way of handling things, and I think between the two of us, we kind of do I don't know, it's not a good cop, bad cop, but we rely on each other to identify, is this a problem? Yeah, I think this might be a problem. Okay, you steer from this side. Okay, I'm going to steer from this side, and just come up with the gentle language. We've never been in a situation where we've had to, for instance, call somebody and say, I don't think it's working out. I'd be fascinated to hear if someone has been in that situation.
I think it is related to sort of who we picked to be part of the research project. And we had 2 focus groups to get started for PCORI, and there were lots of viewpoints. And because I'm looking at breast imaging, I knew that I needed somebody who could have a really moderate point of view, who really didn't feel one way or the other. And so that meant that some of the participants were really cut out from the beginning as not being great, being able to accept all viewpoints and represent that within the discussion. And I think Mary and Dianne both were able to epitomize that role in that way. So it's really being selective. You know, I think it's great to hear sometimes this diverse range of experiences and opinions. But at some point you have to sort of trim the tree a little bit.
I want to pick up on one thread there before we go to our next question, and that's, team science. There are crazy patients. I know a lot of crazy researchers, and I know a lot of crazy clinicians, right? And so I think, how do you create a good, effective team? Because there are very strong personalities that transcend the perspective that's represented. And I think that the things that we talk about, like conflict resolution, communication skills, that is about team management. And it does oftentimes, I think, rely on the principal investigator or the project manager, whoever serves in that key personnel role, to kind of manage those teams. But I think as we involve more people on any team, it's figuring out how do you find those right balances. So I just want to call that out, that I am very selective at times about who I engage with on the research side, because I've had some really negative experiences too. So it's, as a patient mentor of mine once said, it's not just a patient thing. So I just want to call that out. Dawn, I know you had a question.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one piece to that question. We had a person who participated in a genetic study who was actually very fearful of basically looking at heritage and in her children, and looking at and potentially impacting her benefits in the future. And so how it came across in the focus group was very defensive and very fearful. But acknowledging that fear and talking about it dispelled it, and actually brought it out in a very healthy environment. And so we were actually able to talk about what was the precipitating factor behind their fearful response. And it actually ended up actually helped with how the focus group was. But we had to let her speak and have her voice. And I think that was the issue, is kind of making sure that everybody has a voice, even if it's something that we don't necessarily understand or want to hear. And so, sorry, I just wanted to make sure that came out.
I'm going to call on Dawn, and then can somebody make sure Tony gets a microphone?
So thank you. I'm learning a lot. I'm in my second half of my third year, my last year of a PCORI project, a randomized controlled trial, which typically we do those in 5 years. So it's been a real thrash to get just the science side done. And I think there wasn't nearly as much great tools and models of engagement when we got started. One thing we've struggled with, and I'd love your opinions on, is originally I thought my research manager would also kind of help me manage the patient engagement side of it. And I found that there was so much on the side of the research that and it really wasn't within his skill set. I think it could become within his skill set, but we didn't have the time for him to learn that. So he's really been in charge of that. And we've had a team member, a scientific team member, be a liaison. I think we call her our engagement lead on the science side. But as I'm listening over the last day, I keep wondering how much maybe we should have thought about more about shared governance and involving our patient partners as even having more of a leadership role. And I'm wondering if that's in particular in Karen, your study, do you two kind of lead the patient partner group, or how do you kind of manage that to make sure those things get done? Because as PI, you're often kind of pulled in many directions on a project.
Yes. And it's a team. And Susan had these skills, and I think it comes intuitive for both of us in order to do projects this way. And I realize the more I do this, the less intuitive it is for other people. And so,
well, you always say that you chose us, but we always remind you that we chose you. So it was like a good fit. And the way the team presents itself, it's honest, it's respectful. You can really get excited about this research. And we didn't know each other. We both kind of approached them after the initial meeting and said, "Oh yeah, we want to do more," just because of the impression that you guys made.
Well, and I think so. I'm one of those weird people who's chosen to be a career project manager, and I think I'm coming up on 25 years at this point in time, and so that may help. I suppose being most likely to be a talk show host, voted as most likely to be a talk show host in high school. Like Karen was saying, it's kind of a little bit in our nature. And then I would say on Karen's side, Karen possesses a rare humility in science, and I don't mean to insult scientists, but her open-mindedness and her recognition that despite her having incredible skills, she can't do it all, and she's willing to trust someone to pick up some of the important pieces is, I think, a part of the model that works as well.
Daniel? Oh, Tony, hold on. We get Tony with the microphone and then Daniel, and then we'll
Okay. I think we have to learn to give ourselves permission to shift focus deliberately, because we're managing a multiple thing when we're managing this. And sometimes the intensity, as you said, of the person's feelings force that to be center stage for a minute. Doesn't have to be forever. But I think that ability to realize it's all right to be in charge and shift the focus, and if you do it respectfully to the person that's trying to share, it's a big skill, and it sounds like you manage it beautifully.
Thanks, Tony. I think we definitely heard that facilitation piece is truly a skill, and I think that ability to deliberately shift and to refocus the conversation is an art form. One person who has it is Daniel, and you now have the mic, so you had a question.
I just wanted to be very specific on some of the things that we do, and that is that we have a patient represented on essentially every one of the committees, including the administrative committee at the top. For something like a scientific committee, that's challenging sometimes. And so all this questions about, like, what do you do at the end of your study? Well, what we do is we graduate people who are on a study to being on an advisory board of that level, where they may not even know the new therapeutic area, but they understand kind of what this might mean, and they're the voice in the room to remind that committee that, well, don't forget we have to involve patients at this point, or don't. So I do think that there is a way to have co-leaders and representatives from patients and stakeholders on all the committees, not just the patient advisory committee or stakeholder advisory committee, but the other committees. But back to Nancy's point yesterday, I think those are individuals who maybe have had this journey for a couple of years before they graduate to that.
Oh, so we've got 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to table discussion. So Nate and then Lynn.
Thanks. So I just wanted to add that sometimes those can be episodic cases. We had a case with our own patient advisory group where we had a presenter who was discussing a project related to diabetes, especially diabetes in the safety net. And we have a patient advisor who came to that meeting who was literally informed in the ER 2 days prior to that meeting that they were a type 2 diabetic, and they were still interested in being in the meeting, but there's still a lot of trauma from that experience. And I would just advocate that having enough resources for those types of focus groups or meetings to be able to have someone who can help mitigate a case like that when we realize anyone in the role of being a person who's sharing their personal in the professional realm as their disease condition is part of what they advocate for in a group like that. There's a lot of risk that can come with that, and people can be very vulnerable. Anyone, and we felt this person's been a great advisor, but that was a case where I think we really want to make sure they had time outside the meeting to really breathe and talk through that, and then to just know that it's an important and a very vital role that they've had since then on that project, but it could be a very episodic situation when people are coming to a meeting with a frame of mind that could be really difficult to be level-headed and to just be able to really think through things clearly. And so they're very upset at the system when they came to that meeting and said, no one informed me of the symptoms, no one informed me of the potential connections with my family to familial ties to this, and just felt really betrayed. And so I think that, again, critical thinking and advocating for things that we don't want to hear can be some of the most valuable input to how we redesign our communication methods and how we redesign the thinking around outreach for preventative support. And so that ended up being a really valuable perspective. But in that moment, it was really difficult to conduct a meeting. And so just having support to mitigate that is, I think, a really important piece where you don't necessarily have to say this person blew up in a meeting, so we're done with them as an advisor. More of just, it could be episodic and help support in those times where we know the personal could become a piece of a professional meeting.
And I would piggyback on that. Yesterday we talked about venue, and you have to realize that if your venue is to meet in a conference room at the cancer center where people had treatment, you're going to trigger stuff, And you might also trigger things on discussion. Somebody was talking about researching the time between diagnosis and staging of cancer. And I was talking to her for a while, and I said, you're going to trigger a whale of a lot of emotion, because most people just box that time period away and put it on a shelf. And if your discussion group is going to be around that time period, you're going to unleash that. So it's okay to go there, but just know that that's what's going to happen. So I think it does help to have other patients to talk to say, to be kind of forewarned if you're going to step into potential landmines. And the other thing is you might just hit an anniversary date for somebody, or there's all kinds of things that people they can be under control all the time. I think that's a great point, that they can just have a really off day. We all do. We all have off days.
Okay, this is shifting topic a touch. It's going back to talking about the challenge of how to keep people engaged when it's a hurry up and wait, and it may be 2 years till you find out. And somewhere along the line, somebody said touch base regularly. As a patient involved with this, what I most wanted was for somebody to come back 3 months later and just check in. Just say, we're in this 2-year wait period and we're through the first eighth of it, And that is a huge piece of respect. And it's something that I've experienced over and over and over again was just lost. And it's just a plea. And it tied back into a comment at the very beginning, which was being valued and a sense of partnership were the key elements of keeping engagement. And that, I think, just goes straight to the heart of the entire process.
I could just make a brief comment. We actually did focus groups with about 45 women around the country, and they all wanted to know what happens with the research. Well, usually that never happens. And we actually did, Susan can speak to this, you had to go back to the IRB, but we sent all of those women not study results, but a progress report, and that the study was nearing completion and that we valued their input. And this was really reinforced. We had Dr. Leanna Wen speak at a Group Health Research Institute breakfast. And she's, some of you may remember, she's the head of the public health department in Baltimore. And she's like 32 years old. Anyways, she's very bright. When she took that job, she decided to go out into the community and find out what the needs were. And so she and her team would show up with their clipboards, and they'd knock on doors, and the doors would open, and people would say, "What party are you from?" And I think sometimes we do that to people who participate in research. We never get back to them to tell them how valuable their contribution was. So
I wanted to say something along that lines, is that you have to have buy-in from all of the groups, whether it's the patient, the stakeholders, and the advisory board, and how to get that can be really tricky. One of the things at our facility is that when we get the information back from the customer owner, we have to change things up based on what they want. And so, like Renee was talking about the depression tool, we had to come about that because we had a high rate of suicide within our state and in the culture, and people wanted something done about that. And then, so we don't necessarily give back numbers, but we provide them with the stuff that we've done with that. Like, we have behavioral health consultants in our clinics now that every time you go to an appointment, you get a depression screener. And then you can have further information with that, or you can come back for another appointment. So it's just different opportunities that we integrate into the system to provide them.
And then I just wanted to add, I know I've had to deal with my own feelings of inadequacy, not having something to report back. And I think that stopped me from interacting as often as I wanted to. So I felt like, gosh, it's 3 months and I have nothing to report. Like, I'm still like doing that. And so I know personally I've had to force myself to kind of get over those feelings of inadequacy that I haven't necessarily had, or don't have the results yet, or things are just slower. But that's my own thing to kind of deal with. But now it kind of makes me kind of see that I have to really push even harder to make sure that that happens.
One of the things that Karen and I have done is a newsletter, because we meet with our group every 6 months. So we do one on that 3-month increment. And there'll be times, I'll be frank, where Karen will come to me or I'll go to her, what are we gonna put in the newsletter? It's the same kind of thing. But we also, like this past time, we asked for pictures of people doing something that they've enjoyed doing, photographs. We even had one of our members who had a full life and had been married and divorced and had children, and then she rekindled her romance with her high school sweetheart. And so she sent in a picture of her and her high school sweetheart when they were 15, and then a picture of them now, and we put that in the newsletter. And so that's not directly related to the research necessarily, but it is directly related to being human, which then keeps people connected.
At each table, make sure that you have somebody volunteer, or by popular vote, you volunteer someone else. Yeah. We call that voluntold. Yeah. Is there a table that wants to go first to share their great topics? Okay, we've got Janice. Has voluntold her. You guys are going to go second. Okay, so I'm going to ask everybody to keep the roar duller. And so, Makeda, are you ready with your pens to do that really rapid writing and drawing? So this is a great point. So what I'd like everybody to do is, definitely pick somebody at your table who's going to report out. I'd like everybody to be, I don't know if the word was succinct that Makeda used, but we want to be able to get through in the next 10 minutes each of the table. So pick the key things that you think are actionable items that'll really move this field forward. If we don't get through everything, you have 2 opportunities. 1, you can write it down on a sticky note and hand it to Makeda. And 2, at the end of the day, we'll probably wrap up before we do our prioritization as what did you not get to say, or what is not reflected in this models. And that idea came from Daniel, and I appreciate it. So we'll have another opportunity at the end of the day to go back around. So, you can.
Share out, I'll capture what I can, but the 2 that your group chooses to share, somebody at the table write them on sticky notes and give them to me. So at the end, each table should give me 2 that reflects what she said. I may have it written, I may not, but let's make sure that you get them.
Okay. Perfect. Adriana, do you want to report out for your table?
Yes. So our main 2 are to build a dictionary to orient everyone to the project, which can include acronyms, specific terms, whatever it will be. And our second one is to build a sustainability plan for the partnership. So providing opportunities for how others can continue, or check-ins, whatever that may look like, email updates, newsletters.
Sustainability plan?
Yes.
With partners and project, I guess, right?
Sustainability plan, yes.
Sustainability plan.
For the partnership.
Thank you.
So after the funding ends? Yep, perfect. Okay, Lynn, you're up next.
Okay, so our group, underlying everything is that sense of being valued, and respect is shown through funding researchers to engage and to learn how to engage with patients. And one illustration of that would be CME credits. PCORI Research Core program, where one institution would take on being the repository of the process of learning how to do the process well, so that not everybody has to reinvent the wheel. And an illustration then of the things that they would be holding would be the mentoring process that's been brought up here, and circling it back around to being valued all the way through everyone.
Anybody want to go next? Otherwise, we're going to voluntold tables. Oh, in the back.
Thanks. So our patient partners talked about the importance of a mentor, a designated mentor. So we've heard that. And I guess a tangible outcome would be kind of a description of a mentor role, and then also a plan. Is it orient people before a meeting, debrief after a meeting, both, things like that. And then the second would be shared governance models. So we talked about the importance of having people besides researchers set the agenda and facilitate.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Karen, I think we're coming to your table next. Just so you know, you can.
You're okay. So, I guess what we had are some lists of things, or a repository that could be up on a website that people could find examples of things. So one was examples of things that were good at creating team building. So it could be things like ideas about the newsletters, or having two partners, or having lunch meetings so that you have time to really talk over things. How people selected patient partners. I mean, just a whole lot of different things that other groups could put things up. So when a new group goes, they can look at them and see what fits their model and what doesn't. And one thing that came up at the end would be a repository of ideas of dissemination outlets, so that you could have your patient partners involved, whether they are teenagers or whether they're young adults or older people, things. A teenager may not want to be involved in writing a journal article, but what are other ways that patient partners can be involved in getting that information from our studies out there to the population?
Perfect.
Clarify quickly, that first one, was that like an online repository, one for ideas of dissemination of outlets, and the first one was repository of what?
Team building.
Thank you.
All right, Lindsay?
So one of the things that we talked about was, along with the idea of a job description, is creating a transparent document that can be shared among the entire team about everybody's level of training and interest and expertise. That way, when people come together at a meeting, everybody at the table knows that everybody here has had Research 101, or everybody here has had this level of onboarding on the project. That way, levels of language are appropriate. Everybody knows what each other's responsibilities are. So it's not just like one directional, a co-investigator towards a research advocate, but going every direction. Everybody knows what everybody else knows as far as levels of training and expertise.
Perfect.
And then additionally, we talked about having a bottom-up approach, not only once the project gets going, but also in the grant writing process. So engaging patient partners at that point very early on, not just after the fact when you know you've got the funding and you need to complete this step, but when you're drafting your grant.
Thank you. And then I think by process of elimination, we have our table up here in the front. Who's going to be the speaker of the table? Beth?
All right, thanks for giving us some time to visit around the table. That was great. So one of the things that I guess we'll summarize what other people have said, because we agree in some type of like toolkit, essentially that is this repository for all of this information, whether they're mini modules or videos. Some of the ones that we talked about were, again, that Research 101 conversation, but also the flip direction, how a researcher can speak to a patient. Because I know in some of my social circles that I'm in, we do find that hard. And sometimes that data point that we're talking about is the person at the table. And again, we're speaking in an abstract way. And, I know that we've already talked about this already. So that was one thing. Another is looking at, just creating all of these little different steps. And one might explain those roles and expectations in a little video. And if someone's going to participate in the project, that's just another tool that they can have to get a little bit more education about their role and how that might look for the project. Did I miss anything?
Just the stories, sharing your story.
Oh, great. And then the other one was sharing our story, and how when we're around the table introducing ourselves, to just set some context for that meeting, to let people know why we're involved. I think it's easier to sometimes like focus in on that patient that's at the table and how they got to the table, but the researcher, the other stakeholders sometimes don't really get into, not only how did they get to this particular project, but what brought them into this career in general, and how they would like to interact with the group and what they expect out of the team dynamic as well. So thanks.
Perfect.
Did I summarize okay?
Excellent. I think these were really great ideas, and I suspect they're not all of them. So we are about to break for 15 minutes. If you have some items that you want to put on there, write them down on a sticky note, hand them over to Makeda. Go forth, break, get some fresh air. I guess that sounded wrong, right? Grab some coffee, some water, some juice. We're going to mic up our next speakers, and we're going to get started at about 10:30 for our next session.